Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here this afternoon. I'm very pleased to moderate this next session entitled Strategic Foresight for Regulators, Lessons Learned from Government, Diplomacy and Trade. In terms of the format of the session, this will be a fireside chat for roughly about half an hour, and then we'll open the floor to some questions for our speaker to respond to. So as I stand here, maybe I can ask our speaker to join us, Ms. Natalie Black, CBE. Lovely. So to kick us off, what do we mean by strategic foresight? Effectively, strategic foresight is a planning-orientated discipline or an approach to exploring and anticipating future possibilities with the endeavor to shape preferable outcomes in the future. So we're talking about a little bit of looking into a crystal ball, but looking into a crystal ball that's full of data and insights and analytics that help us to see what the future holds. It involves a systematic analysis of driving forces of change, as well as the trends that we're seeing, both current and what we expect in the future. And the goal is effectively to enable organizations as well as governments to be able to capitalize on opportunities that they see in the future, but also to identify and mitigate the risks that are associated with that change that we're expecting to see. How does that play out in reality? Some of you will be very familiar with scenario planning, where we take, groups of assumptions to lay out various scenarios of how we think, events or trends will play out. And that provides a spectrum of possible impacts that we can then analyze and address. It also includes trend analysis. And that's not just limited to economic or political change or trends, but it involves technological trends, environmental, societal trends as well. So the idea being that we're trying to capture that whole context in which we're operating, or that policy issue or that regulatory concern is really going to play out. And last but not least, it typically involves significant stakeholder engagement. And the reason we do that and we spend the time speaking with stakeholders is because diverse stakeholder groups mean diverse perspectives, and that means a more robust analysis of potential impact and the planning for the future. So, given the current context that we're finding ourselves in today, significant technological change that's not only current, but we expect to see, going on into the future, geopolitical volatility, climate impact, as well as social dynamism, the importance of being able to analyze these trends and context to future-proof our policy and regulatory regimes is ever more important. Not only for business, but also for governments who have an even more complex task ahead of them in this regard. And so on this basis, one could not ask for a better speaker to provide insights and lessons learned from her experience in government. And I would like to welcome our speaker today, Natalie Black, CBE. She brings together the rare blend of high-level diplomacy, government strategy, and regulatory leadership, to take us through this complex world of strategic foresight and future planning. Natalie has had a significant career to date. Previously the Deputy Head of the UK Prime Minister's Policy Unit, Director of the Internet Harms Unit, and Director of Cybersecurity in the Cabinet Office. She also pioneered cross-government foresight to address rapidly evolving digital threats and online harms. Prior to that, Natalie was also Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for the Asia-Pacific region. Based in Singapore, she was responsible for developing trade strategy for 15 countries, and she navigated landmark digital economy agreements, embedding this long-term scenario planning that we've just talked about into trade diplomacy. Natalie is currently Ofcom's Group Director for Networks and Communications, as well as an Executive Board member. She heads critical work on telecoms infrastructure, the implications of AI, and future-ready connectivity regulation. Thanks so much for joining us today, Natalie.
Thank you, Samantha. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm looking for, yes, I got 2 thumbs up. That's fantastic. This is my first visit to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is a beautiful, beautiful venue. A big thank you to CST, to your colleagues, Samantha, for making us feel so welcome. I'm very excited for the next couple of days.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. So, to kick off, you've had a very impressive career to date, Natalie, working at the heart of government and diplomacy, from the Prime Minister's policy unit to being a trade commissioner in the Asia-Pacific region. How did you and how do you continue to apply strategic foresight and scenario planning in a real-life government context?
Well, you've been very kind, Samantha. I feel like I should manage the audience's expectations on my experience. But I hope today that I can offer some practical examples of how I've personally used strategic foresight in developing policy, but also I hope trigger a bit of a debate in a world of so much uncertainty. How do you plan for the future? And of course, here in Saudi Arabia, you have a very impressive future vision. And so I think this is much a case of what can I learn from being here as maybe a few lessons I might be able to share with all of you. But I think from a policymaker's point of view, and my background is as a civil servant and as diplomat, as Samantha says, quite often we are always trying to rush to solve a problem. There's a lot of pressure to come up with an answer as quickly as possible, often with good reason. You have a crisis, you have an emergency. And I would argue that it is always a good investment to upfront, ahead of time, put resources, put time, put effort into trying to anticipate what the world might look like in the future. Now, you might be wrong, as Samantha says, that crystal ball can be wrong. You can potentially come out with different ideas that turn out not to be right. But in many ways, the process is more important than the outcome. That as policymakers, we are forcing ourselves to get out of the day-to-day, answering questions, answering emails, and really trying to think about what the world might look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. Now, of course, how do you do that? I've seen lots of different models all around the world. Samantha mentioned that I used to live in Singapore. I lived in Singapore for 5 years. And certainly they have invested a lot of time and effort into strategic foresight capability. And maybe today we'll talk about the different models that are available. But you have the one extreme end, a very separate team where they spend 100% of their time looking into that crystal ball. And then the other end, a more integrated approach where it becomes a core part of policy. And I think there are pros and cons of both, and maybe we'll explore that a bit today.
Great. So maybe you can take us through a couple of those examples where you felt that strategic foresight has really led to a different policy outcome or a different recommendation to policymakers that may have not been there without this process and without that dedicated approach.
Yes, so I think this is very true in the context of trade. I think trade has fundamentally changed, particularly over the last 5 years. So if we were sat here 10, 15 years ago, we would have been worrying about the trade of goods predominantly. How do you get X to Y on a boat, on a plane? And certainly from the UK perspective, our economy and our trade in particular is fundamentally dominated by services. Services make up nearly 70% of our exports. And of course, the way trade of services has changed is linked to the technological development, not just of the UK, but of the world. You know, many of you will be on your phones today. The way that you digest your digital services is instantaneous. So the rules that you need to care about from a government point of view of how do you make services work have fundamentally changed. And so when we were thinking about trade for the future of the UK, when we left the European Union, we shifted quite substantially from focusing predominantly on goods to really thinking about services. and I was based in Asia. And when you look at the demographic changes that you see in Asia anticipated for the next 10 years, very similar to here in the Middle East. Rapid growth of the population, rapid increase of young as a proportion of that population growth, massive increase in energy demands, massive increase in technological opportunities. By looking at those demographic and technological changes, it helps us really think about what would an effective future strategy be. Just because you've been successful in the past doesn't mean you're going to be successful in the future. We've all seen those investment warnings, haven't we, at the bottom? Past success does not guarantee future success. And I think that's the big lesson when you are thinking about future strategy, to not get too comfortable, to really try and put yourself in the position of looking at how the world is changing and recognizing that. Sometimes there are very uncomfortable truths that you might have to put forward to ministers, to senior leaders of business, CEOs, board members, where you are having to challenge the status quo and challenge maybe how they have thought about issues. And certainly as we left the European Union, and we were doing that in the context of our trade agenda, some of those conversations were uncomfortable because we were talking about how the UK economy was fundamentally going to change and what its offer needed to be to Asia, which again, it was fundamentally changing as well. I don't think there's any part of the world that isn't changing. And I think maybe that leads on to some of your other questions, Samantha, but a key tenet of leadership, I think, for the coming years is going to be being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that is the reality of the world. And when you look at very successful people around the world, they are comfortable in that reality, being comfortable with being uncomfortable with the uncomfortable.
Great. No, I think that's really fascinating. And you've already mentioned that there are some governments in the world that have embedded this approach already into their, broad-based, planning processes. Singapore, you mentioned, and you also pick up on a point around, being comfortable with kind of that uncertainty in the environment that you face. And I think, given that we're at an ITU event, looking at how the role of the telecoms or telecommunications regulator has changed over the last, say, 20 years has been fundamental. I mean, when you think about 30 years ago, where a telecoms regulator was very much focused on terrestrial communications capabilities, and now we're talking about not only mobile phones, non-terrestrial satellite communications, broader technologies that we're embedding into that communication system. I know that the CST also have space and other elements that they consider as well. And that just creates a very uncertain world, especially when, technology is changing at such a pace. So how can we take, some of those insights, some of the preparations that other governments are doing in the world to really help telecommunications, or that sort of role of the regulator, to develop, to kind of be ahead of the game when we're talking about significant technological change?
This is such a good question. So I work for Ofcom, the UK's communications regulator, and we are independent of government. And I think this is very important because it means that we have the freedom to focus on the long term and the future. And we worry less about the things that are happening day to day, because that is not our role. And in a world of so much uncertainty, and to be honest, so many exciting new things, I think there is a bit of a risk that you jump from one exciting thing to a new exciting thing. We've all been in that meeting where someone mentions something very exciting and suddenly that sucks up all the energy and all the focus. And I do think there's a very important role for a regulator to maintain that strategy and not get too distracted by what could be exciting in the moment, but might not be for the long term. So let me give you a clear example. So in the UK, we are still in the process of rolling out our fibre broadband network. In 2016, about 8% of the country was covered, and we were stuck. We were in a situation where the incumbents company was not innovating and was not building at the rate that we needed. And we were falling behind the rest of Europe in the fiber build. And so what the regulator, in partnership with government, in partnership with business, did was set out a 10-year strategy for rolling out fiber across the UK. And today, as I sit here, we have fiber in 75% of the country. Now, I know there are other numbers here which might be a bit better, but it's been very challenging for us because you're working with lots of different local authorities, different parts of the country. It's not straightforward. So we are now the fastest builder of fiber in the UK, in Europe, apologies. We are halfway through that strategy. We are at the 5-year mark now. And we are currently reviewing the regulatory requirements for the incumbent company who has significant market power to decide what happens for the next 5 years. So it would be very easy for us to get distracted with everything that's going on AI, for example, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. And it's incredibly important that we see this strategy through, because that is what we have told, most importantly, consumers. That's what we've told the people of the UK we will do. That's what we've told the market, investors, that we do. And that's also what we've told the companies. We have a thriving startup community now of fiber broadband builders. And they want to see that we, as a regulator, are going to deliver what we have said publicly. And now we see £3 to £6 billion of private sector investment into fiber every year. Again, those numbers might seem small to you in the context of Saudi Arabia, but for the UK, this is very, very significant. So the takeaway for me for that is, in all the excitement that is going on, and you want to keep your head up, and you want to understand how the market is developing and changing, but you've also got to be careful not to get distracted. Where you have a clear outcome that you want to achieve, in this case, it is the fiber rollout across the UK. We need to stay consistent with our strategy, but that's not always easy.
No, I think that's a great reflection, and it is very easy to get distracted by all of the exciting developments that are happening at the moment. Focusing on that sort of long-term objective, is this an approach that Ofcom has always had, or has there been institutional kind of shifts or cultural shifts internally to the institution itself to make sure that this approach to planning, strategic foresight, etc., is embedded as the modus operandi?
Yes, I think it is actually core to our DNA. Again, it comes back to our independence and being able to take that long-term vision, regardless of which type of government is in power. I think what's changed, though, is that although we have this commitment to the long term, and that's not going to change, the expectations of the population has changed. They want to engage with us in a way that is a lot more instantaneous. And you see this certainly around the consultation mechanism. So when we are talking to communities about how policies might change. So for example, we've just made very big changes to our Royal Mail delivery service. Now, the Royal Mail was established under Henry VIII. If you want to talk about history, the Royal Mail in the context of the UK really is something. And so to make those changes to institutions which people really love and they really care about, quite rightly, requires consultation in a slightly different way from how we did it even 2 years ago, let alone 5, 10 years ago. And that's something that we are starting to get our heads around in terms of how do you use social media to consult? How do you make sure that you consult with different groups around the country? For those groups, particularly older populations who maybe aren't connected to the internet in the same way, how do you make sure that they feel that they are included? And I think populations are becoming more digitally divided, ironically, in some ways. And so how do you take account of that in the policy-making process?
Great. And I think, you've picked up on one of the core tenets of that sort of strategic foresight, I guess, theory is around, strategic engagement with a broad stakeholder group. So how, in the approach that you take to engaging diverse stakeholders, how do you balance and manage those diverse perspectives that you receive and that you interact with whilst also trying to kind of create and build that trust relationship with those populations that you're engaging?
This is a really good question, and I would not at all suggest that we have perfected the answer. I think you have to continue to learn how to engage with the people that ultimately you are there to serve. You work for them. It's not the other way around. You know, Ofcom is there to serve the population of the UK, and I'm sure many of you feel this in your roles in terms of serving the population of Saudi Arabia. So how do you stay connected? And for me, it's still, I'm a big fan of personal interaction. This is why the UK is represented here at this conference. At the end of the day, even with social media driving so many of our interactions, personal interaction still makes a massive difference. And so from an Ofcom's point of view, we have offices around the country. We spend a lot of time talking to different consumer groups in person. And increasingly, we spend a lot of time with younger populations, actually. I think that's increasingly important because they can teach us so much.
Yeah.
They are going to tell us how they are going to consume communications infrastructure, whether that's where they're going to get their news from, how they're going to talk to their friends. And Ofcom, we publish a lot of research in terms of, and I encourage you to Google some of the research projects we put out recently around digital literacy. So we've seen a massive increase in the use of YouTube, for example, in the UK. And what does that mean for how populations are learning? What do they want to see in terms of bite-size interactions? So there's a common theme of change, but I would come back to my sort of beginning remarks in that you don't want to rush to what might be the outcome as a consequence. You still need to be quite careful about what lessons do you draw.
Sure. No, I think that's a very important point, particularly when you're trying to distill the different perspectives from such a broad audience and population, not just for now, but also for the future, and how some of those perspectives and even behaviors change over time. I wonder, just maybe we can pick up a little bit more on the kind of the youth angle, but also on the warning and I guess the advice that you're giving about not rushing, and maybe turn a little bit more to the discussion around AI. And obviously the last 2 to 3 years have seen significant, or almost an exponential explosion in attention given to AI, not just from a policy and decision makers perspective, but from users, even up to kind of my parents asking me if they need to download ChatGPT on their mobile phones, to how we're using it in industry, in the private sector more generally, in education. And how has Ofcom really approached an emerging technology such as AI? It's obviously itself emerging at such a rate and developing, but also future technologies that are coming down the line quite rapidly, like quantum computing, for instance.
Exactly. So look, this is the core question for any regulator around the world at the moment. How do you make the most of this wave of innovation and harness the benefits for your country, while at the same time recognizing there's a whole range of challenges, many of which we haven't identified yet or even understand? So from our point of view at Ofcom, we have always seen a key part of our remit as enabling growth and enabling innovation. So we issue innovation licenses, for example, for new technology. Last year, Vodafone did the first ever satellite to mobile call in the world on the top of a hill in South Wales, if any of you have ever been there. And that's a great example of a regulator working with a business to do something different. And I always think there will be a role for a regulator in that space. And we need to provide the safe environment where you can test things without worrying about what the implications are necessarily if you don't even know where you're going yet. So you would want to make sure that you're not stifling the opportunity for new innovation to emerge. But that's a delicate balancing act. That's not easy. And a lot of it is based on trust. And certainly teams across Ofcom spend a lot of time meeting startups, meeting investors, getting to know them, getting to understand where innovation is emerging, and then looking for opportunities that we can support. On AI specifically, so Ofcom does not regulate AI, the technology itself. Regulators across the UK instead focus on the effects of AI on the sectors that we regulate. And so in June of this year, we published our strategic statement on AI. If you're interested, I would thoroughly recommend that you download it and give it a read. It's not very long on purpose, to give particularly startup founders the opportunity to understand how we're thinking about AI as part of their engagement with us. But what we've done in that document is identified some of the use cases that we're starting to see come through the communications sector, and identify opportunities for us to collaborate and support. And I think what's interesting on the AI side is, of course, when you think about telecoms infrastructure, for example, massive opportunities to increase efficiency, develop new services, and give consumers overall a much better experience. The challenge, I think, is particularly around the deployment of agentic AI, is what that will mean for the consumer experience. So traditionally in the UK, we've worried a lot, for example, about pricing of services. So whether that's price of your mobile contract, price of your broadband contract. And we've worked hard on our interventions to make sure that there's lots of choice, not only in terms of service providers, but also in packages. And what we're likely to see with the deployment of agentic AI is a lot of that choice architecture will disappear, because you will be telling the agent, this is the kind of thing I'm interested in, but then over to you. And so what does that mean for the role of a regulator? Where do we need to get involved, and what does that look like? And this is where I think it's very important to emphasize the fact that we don't regulate for the sake of it, right? I don't get up every day and think, oh, I really want to regulate. No, that is not the point of a regulator. The point is, what is the outcomes that we are trying to achieve as a country, and how can we use regulation to get there? And I think if you come at it from that concept, and that's certainly how we think about AI, then there are things that we can do to enable the deployment, and particularly support up startups in this community. So just a couple of weeks ago, I was at our AI hub in London. If you're ever in London, I thoroughly recommend you go there if you want to see the pipeline of British AI companies coming through. It's a great place to spend some time. And we were talking about how their products were developing, where they wanted to get into the market. And then that gave me lots of thoughts of, okay, how can I help you? How can we support you from an Ofcom point of view? The flip side is, traditionally, we have worried a lot about vulnerable consumers. What does it mean to be a vulnerable consumer? And that's maybe been someone who hasn't been able to access a phone line, or is worried about paying their bills. Actually, a vulnerable consumer could mean something quite different in the world of agentic AI. It might be someone who doesn't understand how an AI agent is making decisions on their behalf. So what does that mean for how we educate people about how to use AI? And what does that mean for how we work with providers who are adopting AI tools to make sure that that's transparent and everyone understands what they're buying and how their data is being used? And the challenge, as we all know in this room, is that this is moving so fast. So the traditional ways of thinking about this are, we'll do a report, we'll consult, and maybe we'll come back in 2, 3, 4 years' time. That's just not going to work. So this is a challenging period for regulators. We're having to rethink how we do our jobs in this era.
No, and I think you mentioned regulators as a whole and as a group, and I think that that's really relevant, not just given the context of the environment that we're in today, but that element around, policy and regulatory coherence, maybe not, direct sort of coordination or policy mimicry, but really looking at how we can create a global sort of policy vision and a global regulatory framework that benefits all in terms of some of the the opportunities that you're talking about, but also protects those who are vulnerable, not just from being excluded in that traditional, digital sense, but also being able to participate on a level playing field, with their peers, regardless of where you are in the world, when you're talking about, the application of this technology. So Obviously, the UK government has an approach, and Ofcom has its role to play in that. How do you interact with, regional or even international bodies to sort of support the development of that kind of broader global policy architecture that, we all believe that we need?
Again, I think this is a very interesting question, and I always go back to actually to COVID and the pandemic, and my big lesson from that period of time is no one can deal with the challenges of the modern world by themselves. Yeah. And so forging new partnerships is more important than ever. And this is at every level of society. So Ofcom, the regulator for the communications sector in the UK, we are also a member of the UK's regulatory network. So we spend lots of time with other regulators from across the UK, because where there are opportunities, there will be requirements for collaboration. So, for example, on data centers, a hot topic here and a hot topic in the UK, we will work with the regulators who are also thinking about water and thinking about energy when we consider the deployment of data centers across the UK. And then when you start looking at a European level, for example, we will meet with our European colleagues while we're here in Saudi Arabia. So that regional cooperation, I think, is very important. And obviously the GCC here. And when I was based in Asia, ASEAN, I think the rise of regional blocs is very important and provides a lot of opportunity to really energize collaboration in a meaningful way. And then, of course, we're all here for the international ITU event. Yeah. And I think that's because people find real value in learning from each other's experiences and recognizing that, of course, our individual circumstances are always going to be very, very different. And you should never underestimate the variance of context. But more often than not, there are a lot of similarities, and particularly in the era of AI, I think we worry about the same things. We worry about how do you make sure that AI is really beneficial to the economy? What does it mean for my child who's maybe 18 and is looking for a job? What does it mean for the population who are maybe a bit older and are worried about whether they're going to hold on to their jobs? What does it mean for my child at home who might be accessing the internet in a way that I don't really understand? All of those issues are actually increasingly global issues. The solutions might not be global because we all have very different circumstances at home, but we can learn a lot from each other from comparing notes, I think.
No, and I think that's an interesting segue into also drawing on your multifaceted background. Telecommunications and communications in general helps to break down barriers, but I think over the recent past we've seen some of those sort of more physical barriers being kind of put back into place from a trade perspective in particular. And in order to facilitate that kind of global telecommunications, communications and technology partnership that you're mentioning, we are assuming that there is sort of a free flow, not just of the technology, but also of that really valuable supply chain that's important to the infrastructure that is necessary. So with that in mind, how do you see sort of trade and diplomacy and kind of regulation kind of coming together in the near future? And if it doesn't, what is the risk for us ahead?
I feel this is a very tricky political conversation. I'll be very careful what I say. No, I think, the reason why I wanted to move to a regulator after I'd worked in trade for 5 years as trade commissioner was because I think a regulator is genuinely at the pinpoint of some of the toughest conversations that we face in our individual countries, but around the world. And the issue is we have this moment in time, and I see this in Riyadh in terms of the energy that is here. And I think lots of people, whether you're there, whether you're in London, feel we have this moment in time to make the most of technology as it's emerging, to solve some problems that have been around for a very, very long time, and to do it in a way that is genuinely in the benefit for the communities that we serve. But that does involve addressing some very tough issues. Ofcom, one of our big roles is looking at competition. How do you make sure that you genuinely have competitive markets? And whether that's trade issues, whether that's the emergence of big tech, that is challenging our traditional perceptions of what competition looks like. So I don't think there's a more exciting time to be looking at these issues, but I certainly don't pretend that I myself or certainly the UK have all the answers. But the important thing, I think, is that we give time to look at these issues in depth, and we challenge each other where we disagree. I mean, one of the things we haven't touched on in terms of a concept, but it's one I really enjoy, is red teaming. You know, when you're working through a problem and you come to your conclusion, and then you create a separate team who hasn't had anything to do with the process, and you give them the same foundational information, and you see if they come to the same conclusions. And pretty much through all my policy work that I've ever done, that's been a tool I've lent on heavily, because it challenges preconceptions, it challenges groupthink. And I think particularly in this era where there's so much uncertainty, and as I say, you need to be uncomfortable with the uncomfortable, then having other people challenging your thinking is a very, very healthy tool, because it's always much better to make mistakes in private and for your friends and your colleagues to tell you that you haven't got it quite right, and to be a bit humble, right? In terms of no one really has all the perfect answers. So that's why I like red teaming, because it forces you to reflect on where you're trying to go.
Great. All right. Well, I think we're going to pause there for me, kind of interrogating Natalie at this point.
Interrogation there. Thank you so much.
And to open up to the floor to see if there's any questions from the audience. Don't be shy. Natalie has been very generous with her insight, so I'm sure she will respond accordingly to your questions. Yes. There's a microphone coming. Thank you. Oh, gosh. Are we going to hear it?
Hello? You hear me?
Just give me 1 second so I can hear. Apologies. I think that's okay, yeah?
All right. So thank you very much for a very good talk. I'm Admire Maliti from a regulator in North Macedonia. And of course, you know, all regulators in the world pretend that they are independent, and we are, you know, on paper. But given the fact that, you know, recently most of governments are, you know, becoming like more aggressive in trying, you know, to do their policies, which sometimes, you know, are in contradiction with what regulators, you know, have as a strategy. I want if you can explain us a situation where, you know, let's say the UK government has tried to pressure Ofcom, you know, to change some strategy or something. For instance, when rolling out this fiber optics or so, and how your institution deals with such, you know, informal pressures, so you can move on with your strategy as you have outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And it's a very real question, I think, for, as you say, regulators around the world in terms of how do you enact your responsibilities. So the way that it works in the UK is Ofcom reports to our Parliament. We take that extremely seriously. So we are required to present to a number of different committees, both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, so our two chambers, and regularly. I think for the last sitting that's just finished, we did maybe 6 or 7 hearings. So it's a big part of our work, and we take our accountability extremely seriously. But I think what we always rely on is our expertise. So we invest very heavily, particularly in our economic expertise, in our legal expertise, and we follow the data. You know, what does the data tell us? And I think it goes back to that long-term perspective, because that's the real value, I think, of a regulator in terms of providing that stability to a market. But we are ultimately, the way, way I describe it, we're all part of Team GB. We're all part of Team Great Britain. And we are there to focus on supporting the outcomes that are required for the country. We might have different views on how to do that. And of course, as you allude to, that's where some of the discussions can come. But ultimately, I think that credibility around data and expertise is very, very important. And that's why we invest so heavily. And that brings us back to the foresight point in terms of making sure that we stay up to date in terms of how the market is developing. But also being open to challenge. And that's why the consultation process is so important, because lots of different people are going to disagree with us. And so being really transparent about how we are making decisions is very important. And ultimately, they can be challenged in court. We are regularly in court because particularly the telecommunications sector is very litigious by its nature. But that, I think, is the balancing act that we're all trying to walk. But ultimately, you're trying to achieve the best outcomes for the country.
Great. Any other questions? Oh, there's just behind. Yep.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll be greedy to ask 2 questions with your kind permission.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. My first question is, you spoke about the 75%. I'm from the Nigerian Communications Commission, I'm sorry. My name is Mohammed from the Nigerian Communications Commission.
Mohammed.
Okay, thanks. You spoke about the 75% fiber build you achieved in the UK. How did you deal with funding, private sector, government involvement? Did you deal with subsidies? How are you able to achieve that in a liberalized economy? So that's my first question. Then the second question is, you spoke about AI. You're not regulating AI as a technology, but you are regulating AI usage. How do you balance between regulating the technology itself and the output of the technology, which is the usage itself? How do you get the balancing act in between those 2 activities? Thank you very much.
These are brilliant questions, Mohammed, and we could probably speak for hours on these, so I will try to be as succinct as possible. On your first question on the fiber rollout, so that was, so apart from those communities where we believed it was not possible to stimulate competition, because particularly in rural areas where you were only going to have one provider, that has been subject to a public subsidy. But the majority of the country, the vast majority of the country, that is private sector build. So it is not subsidized by the government. And we have stimulated that investment through the regulatory measures that we set out. I think at the time it was a bit of a bet in terms of a strategy, but it's a bet that's paid off. And we have gone, as I said, from what most people agreed was the laggard in Europe in terms of very, very slow to build, to be the fastest. And that's because the company that had significant market power was forced to change its approach to the market. And the remedy that's I think most people hold up as the most successful in the regulations that we put on the company was, this is very practical, but we opened up the ducts and poles. So the ducts, as those, I can see nodding heads. For some of you, this is very weird. So the ducts under the ground in terms of the cables connecting the country, and the poles, literally the poles coming up on streets. And we forced the company to open those up, which then enabled a whole wave of new companies to start up and build infrastructure across the country. So I think it's an interesting example because it's very practical and it comes from really understanding the market, but it didn't require any investment from the government. And that's where I think competition can make a big difference. On your point on AI, it's still very early days, so I certainly don't have a definitive answer for you in terms of how do you regulate the AI adoption within the sector. But what it is forcing us to do is rethink those powers that we currently have. Are they sufficient? Will we be able to protect consumers from harm in the way that we do in 5-10 years' time? But the flip side of that is, what more can we do to stimulate the AI adoption? Are there areas where we should get out of the way? Are we preventing, either directly or indirectly, because startups are unsure where we sit, from innovation happening because people don't want to take the risk, because they don't want to enter the market? So I think there's a lot that we can do to facilitate conversations and actually use our soft power as a regulator. I hope that, you know, the brand of Ofcom is very strong, and people know us quite well. So that's a useful soft power tool to bring people to the table and have conversations. It doesn't always have to be about the hard toolkit that we can bring out to make changes in a market. The soft power quite often is one, it can be a lot cheaper for everyone, but also more efficient, because you're not looking to require legislation or other measures. And in this world, I keep coming back to the world of being uncomfortable in the uncomfortable. Part of that is recognizing that you need to use the full spectrum of your toolkit and not just rush to the hard end. Actually, the soft end can often be more efficient and more effective.
Next question. There's one in the front. Thank you.
السلام عليكم.
السلام عليكم.
أنا الطالب عبد العزيز الأحمري، متدرب في هيئة الإذاعة والتلفزيون، تخصصي اقتصاد. فسؤالي هو، وش الحدود الحالية للذكاء الاصطناعي، وإلى أي مدى يمكن يؤثر في مستقبل الاقتصاد؟
Sorry, we're just waiting for translation.
أسمعكم. تسمعوني؟ أوكي.
Are you able to ask the question in English?
ما هي
Apologies.
حدود الذكاء الاصطناعي؟
1 second, please. No. I think we're just waiting for translation.
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Are you okay to ask
Yeah,
in
I
English?
can hear. I can hear. Okay. وش هي حدود
sorry.
الحالية؟
Oh, sorry. If you switch to 2.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we are. Try that.
Can you try again?
Yeah. I can hear you, but you can.
Can't seem to change the channel. Do you want to? Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
تسمعوني؟ اوكي. أنا آسف. مجددا سؤالي هو، وش الحدود الحالية للذكاء الاصطناعي، وإلى أي مدى يمكن أن يؤثر على مستقبل الاقتصاد؟
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your patience as well. Apologies for that. I think pretty much everyone agrees now that AI is going to be fundamentally transformative for the economy. In fact, it already is. I think particularly when you talk to young people, the way that they use AI in every element of their lives gives you quite an insight to the future. So at Ofcom, we've just had a group of interns, so there's 19, 20, spending the summer with us. And I think I learned more in 20 minutes talking to them than some of the best AI experts in the world. But I think that's the nature of the technology. The challenge is that deployment is not universal, obviously. Here in Saudi Arabia, I know you are leaders in AI adoption and have great ambitions. Across the world, experiences are going to be different. And so the economic impact is going to be different. And so I think it's important to think about the fact that already we have digital inequality. We have a digital divide, whether that's whether you have access to the internet, let alone whether you have access to ChatGPT. So will that divide get worse over the next couple of years? And what do we do to mitigate that?
شكرا لكم.
Great. Any more questions?
Hi, Dr. Samantha. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Samantha and Natalie. Great panel. Thank you very much. You can hear me now? I will ask in English.
Okay.
Yeah. My name is Khalid. I am you hear me, right?
No, I can't.
Okay, let me,
Sorry.
if you just do this.
Go ahead.
Hi, Natalie.
Thank you.
You hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you for the debate. It's very useful. Great panel. My name is Khalid. I'm a telecommunication engineer from National Guard here in Saudi Arabia. My question is, how is Ofcam balancing the need for fair competition and consumer protection in the UK telecom market, while also ensuring that operators can invest profitably in the next generation infrastructure, such as 5G, probably 6G as well, and full Viper networks? Thank you.
This is a fantastic question. This is probably the hardest part of my job at the moment, particularly because the mobile market in the UK and the fibre market in the UK, they haven't seen growth for some time. And so how do you ensure there are the right incentives to invest at a time that it can be difficult to rebate that investment? So it's part of our requirements that when we look at any decision in front of us, that we not only look at the impact on consumers, but also the investment environment and how do the decisions that we are making impact the incentives to invest. So I mentioned that we're halfway through this 10-year strategy on the fibre rollout. And the market review that we are doing at the moment will absolutely look at the investment incentives. The challenge around 5G in particular is that adoption has been slower in the UK than we expected. Customers haven't always seen the benefits. And so part of the challenge for the market, and not just for Ofcom, is making sure that the benefits are articulated and explained and realised. And certainly then you get on to the debate on 6G. If consumers don't think like that they're getting the benefits from 5G, then why are they going to be interested in 6G? And so I think particularly over the next couple of years, that's where the real focus is going to be. But again, that's potentially the opportunity of AI, because it might bring forward use cases that haven't been realised so far. And so will that stimulate a greater adoption of 5G and in time in 6G? But it's interesting in the UK, I'm not sure what the situation is here, but we've seen a bit of a plateauing in terms of data consumption. So to a degree, everyone expected data consumption to be exponential. Right? We always thought we would want more, we would want more. But actually, particularly on the services side, that hasn't been our experience so far. Maybe we will see a shift in that in the coming years. But it is certainly difficult for the operators in terms of justifying to their boards and their investors return on investment. And that's certainly something we're mindful of. Thank you for the question.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Are there any takers? No, I can't see any hands. No more questions? All right, then. Well, maybe, Natalie, I can ask you for your sort of closing thoughts. You know, based on the discussion and the insights that you've provided today, I'm sure that you've inspired a number of regulators or those who don't even work in regulation to consider strategic planning as an approach, strategic foresight as a planning approach. What advice would you give, to those individuals that may be looking at building this kind of functionality into their organizations? And if you had to start from scratch, kind of where would you start?
Good question. So you've heard me say already that I always think an investment in strategic foresight is worthwhile, both from an outcome perspective, but also the process in itself, in encouraging you to think about issues that you might have not have done, build relationships with organizations that you might not have thought of when you're asking both yourself the questions, but also the external market. I suppose my only warning would be I've seen quite often that exercise is done in isolation from the rest of an organization. And we've talked at the beginning about the spectrum. Some organizations have a strategic foresight function, which is quite standalone from the rest of the organization. Maybe you've been in the room where you've said, oh, we're not really sure what they do. They think about the future. That's not very helpful if that's not integrated into the policy process and the rest of the organization. So I think it's very important that when you're gazing into that crystal ball, that is seen as an exercise for the whole organization and one that benefits the whole organization. And ultimately, it needs to have some practical outcomes. Otherwise, you end up with a long report that gets put in a drawer somewhere and it all gets a bit dusty. So forcing yourself to really consider, what have you learned from this exercise? Again, you might be uncomfortable with some of the lessons that you've drawn and some of the realities of, say, for example, if you're looking at a market and realizing that actually it's not going to have the investment opportunities that you thought it might have. But addressing those earlier are always going to be worth the payback. But of course, as I say, you don't want to do that in isolation. You want to be part of an organization. And ultimately, I think that's what drives real joined up policy outcomes. One which links foresight to implementation is going to ultimately deliver better outcomes, both in terms of the process, in terms of what do you learn along the way, but also then the real world change that you can make.
Great. All right, so I think we've covered everything that was on my list, at least. Thank you so much for your time today, Natalie. I mean, for me, I think the greatest sort of takeaway is really that phrase that you mentioned a number of times about being comfortable in the uncomfortable, and certainly being able to embrace that uncertainty. And certainly from my background, a concept that we've often applied is, if you don't know the context, if you fail, you fail fast and you fail forward. So you take that experience as data that you can then take into the future and to help you make better decisions or more strategic decisions. So on that basis, thank you again for being here today. Thank you for sharing your insights and your perspectives on this really fascinating topic. And thank you again. I hope you enjoy your stay here.
Well, thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you to everyone at Access Partnerships and ITU and CSR more broadly. And best of luck for the rest of the conference. It's a fantastic agenda, and I look forward to meeting many of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.